Welcome to Making Democracy Work, a monthly series brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Honolulu on topics of community interest. Today we're going to talk about the 30-meter telescope and Hawaiians' relationships to the stars. I am Pearl Johnson, Chair of Planning and Transportation. We have with us today Paul Coleman, an astronomer with the University of Hawaii and of Hawaiian ancestry. Thank you. And let's talk about what the benefits of the telescope will be to science.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. And so then the benefits of the 30-meter telescope. Currently, the best technology telescopes on Earth can see only so far into the universe. And the 30-meter will allow us to look 10 times further. And in fact, it will allow us to look with much better resolution as well. So it'll be as if we got fantastic new glasses on the old telescopes, and we can now see with much greater detail, something like a factor of 10 or 12, depending on how the receivers work out.
And even better than the space telescope, right?
Yes, and it turns out it's approximately 12 times better resolution than the space telescope. And it's even better than the new version of the space telescope, which is being planned. It'll be 4 or 5 times better than that telescope.
Mm-hmm. So we'll be able to look into dark matter?
Well, this being able to see further and with higher resolution will allow us to be able to look at dark matter in the universe, look for, we won't see it in particular, but we'll be able to see the effects of dark matter on the general field of the universe. We'll also be able to look more closely at black holes, a fun thing for people to think about and wrap their brains around. And we'll be also particularly able to look for new planets around other stars. And with this telescope, we'll be able to see planets that are similar to the Earth. So far in the, say, hundreds of planets that we've found, we've only been finding these very large Jupiter-like planets. And we think there's not going to be any life in those large Jupiter planets because it's a very hostile environment. Mass is so big, the gravity is so huge. But we think with the 30-meter telescope we'll be able to find Earth-like planets, and so we'll be looking for life like life here on Earth.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be able to see so far that we can see the beginning of the universe?
Well, not the beginning of the universe, because the universe in the current theory starts with a Big Bang, and then it's composed mostly of particles and antiparticles and radiation. And those are so densely packed as the universe expands that you really can't see across the universe. You can't see any further than, say, in front of it. It's as if you were in a smoke-filled room. But as the universe continues to expand and get bigger, the temperatures go down, and eventually the smoke clears, and then a photon is able to travel across the universe without being immediately absorbed by matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so that particular time in the universe, we'll be able to see right up to that, if everything works out.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think King Kalakaua would be looking at this?
Oh, well, he's a personal hero of mine, because he was so together. He was such a Hawaiian guy. But he was also a man of the modern times. So he spoke several languages. I think Hawaiian, German, English, of course, Japanese, I think. But all these different languages. He was a well-respected man of science, and I think he would be very happy to see us putting the 30-meter up there. And this is based on, of course, published things where he actually said things that lead us to believe that he would be completely in favor of the 30 meter. However, he would be a little bit ashamed of the fact that we have so few Hawaiians involved in astronomy here in Hawaii.
Because in his day, many Hawaiians knew exactly what stars were there, what the stars were doing.
Absolutely true. In those days and before contact with the Europeans, Hawaiians were really very, very, very much versed in astronomy. Their whole days were based on what cycle of the moon it was and what part of the year it was, and those were all based on astronomy. Looking up and seeing which stars were rising and which were setting, or what phase of the moon it was, would determine what you would do that day.
And I think you told me earlier that if it weren't for their knowledge of the stars, Hawaiians wouldn't even be here.
That's absolutely true. Anyone who wants to check that out, just get on a boat and go about 100 miles from any island, and you will only see water in every direction. And the only way Hawaiians made that long voyage, that 30-day voyage on an open canoe from the South Pacific to here, was through use of astronomy at night. And so I like to point out that every Hawaiian, the only reason they're Hawaiian is because they have an ancestor who came here on a boat, did that 30-day voyage, and that boat was led here by an astronomer. So really, astronomy is the reason that we are who we are. And I think it's just a shame not to totally embrace that.
So you would call the navigators astronomers?
Oh, definitely. They certainly have to learn enough astronomy to be able to get their boats. And now we're in part of this worldwide voyage. It's an incredible example of the use of astronomy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are really in strange waters, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And probably not very warm waters.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling that's why Hawaiians stopped at Hawaii, because if you go any further, the water gets colder.
Well, and then they
true.
probably knew there wasn't anything else to the north. Well, except for the continent, maybe, but no more islands.
There actually are some historical hints that Hawaiians made it to the continents as well.
Yeah? Oh.
So, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Back to Kalakaua. Now, in 1881, he went to the Lick Observatory, right?
Yes. I'm not sure whether it was his first visit to the continental United States, or if it was part of the world tour where he went completely around the globe. He was, by the way, the first ruler to ever do that. But when he was there at the Lick Observatory, he used, I think it's the 12-inch telescope,
Yes.
a brand new telescope at the time, and he was just wowed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And as a student, as a graduate student, I was able to visit Lick and actually look at the observing logs where it said the king observed till well past midnight.
Mm-hmm.
That was just really very chicken skin time for me.
Mm-hmm. So can we have the picture of what Kalakaua said about the observatory? And this is, all right, so you tell us about this picture.
Okay, so this first picture is it's several different pictures, but it talks about his interest in astronomy, and he hosted, much as we do these days, we have collaborations of people who go to observe all over the world, and he said to England, he said, come use our islands as a place to do observing, and they were going to try to observe the transit of Venus across the sun. Now, of course, we just had one of those in 2012. I hope everybody got to see it, because you have to wait until 2117 for the next one. I probably won't be around then. So this is a series of pictures. One shows the actual telescope and an astronomer sitting behind it. The other is a map of where it is. It's actually, the installation was put up near Kawai Hau Church and the Board of Water Supply. And then this lower drawing is, I find it so fascinating because it's a drawing of the encampment itself, where they actually had to put up a fence around it. And that fence was put there because if you also look in the picture, there's a picture of a bunch of Hawaiians sitting there in a sort of a line trailing off to the right. And the astronomers, they complained that day and night Hawaiians were lined up to look through the telescopes.
Is that right?
To get this augmented view of what the universe looked like, because they all were so familiar with it
Yes.
from their life.
So there was really avid interest.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they had to, in order to they were really worried that the transit of Venus occurs, sometimes it's a several-hour event, but they were supposed to be observing it the entire time, so they were worried that they'd have to tell the Hawaiians that they couldn't be looking during those times.
And that's why they had to build the fence.
And that's why they built the fence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so here's something about the astronomy of the transit of Venus.
Yeah, Kalakaua addressed this group of astronomers who came here to do the observation, and I can't really read it for you, but it's basically, he says it will afford him nothing better than terrific feelings if Hawaii could in some way add to this, monumental thing that they were trying to do. The reason the astronomers were going to observe all over the world was because this transit of Venus would actually allow you to determine the distance between the sun and the Earth, which was not well known at the time. But through transit measurements, they were able to get a very good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So it was considered to be the real breaking thing of its time, just as finding Earth-sized planets around other stars is today, or black holes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then that was 1874. Kalakaua went on his round-the-world voyage not long after that. And he visited the Lick Observatory after having been told about it by Captain Fowler.
Right.
And I'm sorry we do have a quote from the letter, but also online you can see the actual letter, which is in King Kalakaua's own handwriting. And before this quote, which is on the screen, he said, "I must thank you sincerely for the pamphlet you sent me of the Lick Observatory Trust." Then he goes on to say, "Something of the kind is needed here very much." So I think that we can say that he would really have welcomed the 30-meter telescope, don't you?
I think so too. It's in keeping with his whole personality. If he were alive today, he'd have the latest PDA and he'd have the latest smartphone and he'd just be connected to everything.
Mm-hmm.
I have no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And that quote says, in particular, it says that everybody's so busy making money off sugar. The almighty dollar is so important. And I laugh because that's the world today. You just changed the sugar to tourism, and that's unfortunately the case.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the Hawaiians of old had a really intimate relationship with the stars, would you say?
I think so. I think there are just so many parts of their life that were dependent on for example, the phase of the moon or the phase of the year, which part of the year we were in. Although most people can't tell the difference between February and November, but you can if you're really careful about paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
But Hawaiians had sets of stars that rose in November and sets of stars that rose in February, and so that allowed them to actually carefully watch the year as it progressed. The whole beginning of the year was based on the rising of this little cluster Makali'i, in the east as the sun set in the west. And when that happened, then they knew it was time for the Makahiki festival to start. And of course, you know that we had to pay taxes and not so good. But also all war and aggression stopped, and then there were like the Hawaiian equivalent of the Olympic Games. Everybody showed off their athletic prowess, and so even the way in which the year started was based on astronomy. The times to plant certain things was based on astronomy. Whether or not you could actually fish for certain fish. We're now reaching a problem where we have to have certain fishing bans because we're not as smart as the Hawaiians, so we don't restrain our fishing appetites. But they had certain times when you could fish for certain types of fish, and certain times when it wasn't allowed because they were procreating at the time. So Hawaiians were very smart and very in tune with their environment.
On Mauna Kea is a lake, Lake Waiau.
Yes.
Now, where in relation to the telescope is the lake?
The lake is at a much lower elevation than where the telescopes are, and it's actually a little lower in elevation than where the 30 meter is cited to be.
Mm-hmm. I understand that when they first started putting telescopes on the mountain, that they decided not to get close to the lake so as not to interfere with what was going on at the lake.
Yeah, there are actually a few noticeable sacred sites or noticeable cultural sites. One is the Lake Waiau, and the other is the adze quarry, where Hawaiians used to make their tools.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a deliberate decision on the part of the people who sited the first telescopes and also put the first road up to the summit to avoid those areas, so that nowadays they're still in the pristine
Yes.
condition that they were when astronomy first came to the mountain.
About what altitude is that adze quarry?
I'm thinking, and I'm not sure, but I'm thinking it's like 12,000 feet.
Mm.
And the summit is at about 14,000.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that the 30 meter telescope will be sort of halfway between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe
Just
closer
think,
to the
know,
adze. Sorry.
Fashioning adzes at 12,000 feet.
Yeah.
That's physical work, isn't it?
Yeah, I have a great deal of respect for the Hawaiians because not only did they fashion them at that altitude, but it took a little while to walk up that to that altitude.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often tried to get a group of, there's a bunch of crazy people like me who'd like to do this, to just walk up from Hamakua up the side through some of the old trails up to the summit, just to see what it's like, instead of getting in, my little car and driving up.
Yes. Well, have you been to the adze quarry?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I've been over most of the mountain with people who know what's going on there. So I would never recommend going by yourself if you're not knowledgeable about what sites are culturally significant, what aren't.
Mm-hmm. So there are still remains of what were to become adzes?
Well, as I understand, the process for making these, basically they're axe heads, requires chipping away at lava, with lava. So we didn't have any steel tools. So you might make a mistake and then it's ruined. And so they call it debutage. There are just piles and piles of almost or close, but not quite. And also the shavings themselves. Also, an interesting thing is there are carcasses or bones of these petrels that they used to eat. So it's kind of like they went to McDonald's on their way up the mountain, and there's some wrappers, but it's not that. It's the bones of these birds that they would eat.
Mm-hmm.
And the birds had a pretty big fat content, so that was good for the keeping you warm.
Uh-huh. Mm. And then I read that in 1892, W.D. Alexander spent 6 nights on the summit. Are you familiar with that expedition?
I'm not familiar with the expedition, but I know that there have been recorded visits to the summit.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they took was like a 100-pound pendulum.
Mm.
Do you know about
They may have been trying to look at the local gravity fields.
Uh-huh.
Depending on the density of material in the crust, you can get some enhancement to local gravity, so that it's
Which
not
would affect the swinging of the pendulum?
Yes.
And how about the altitude? Does that affect the swinging of the pendulum?
Not really, other than cutting down the amount of air resistance that the
Oh.
pendulum experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But the real thing is gravity.
I see. Uh-huh. So it's very dense there with all the basalt.
I'm not really sure. It would be interesting to see what a gravity picture of the mountain looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I know on Haleakala, for example, there are gravitational effects there,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm just not sure about Mauna Kea.
Mm. We can talk about Haleakala because that's where the first of the observatories was.
Actually, the first observatory was, downtown Honolulu, but then
Yes.
there was one that was out at Makapu'u,
Mm.
above the lighthouse.
Mhm.
If you're on Oahu and you hike up that trail that's off to the side as you head around towards Makapu'u Point, that trail goes up right up to where the old observatory was. So you'll see these big concrete blocks there.
Yeah.
Those were actually the flooring for the first observatory, and
Mhm.
it was also a solar observatory. But based on the results there, that's when they decided to go to Haleakala and build the first sort of more recognizable observatory.
And I guess it would make sense because at Haleakala there was already a road to the top.
Yes, and I find it also very interesting in that we're building solar observatories on Haleakala, the House of the Sun. So in some way, I am kind of guessing that Hawaiians knew how good a place it was for observing the sun. And the reason I say that is, so this is a test that everybody can do. If you're on Haleakala sometime, put your thumb over the sun. And what you will notice is there's no fuzz, in fact, you can see blue right up to your thumb. Okay, what that means is that there's not much interference from the atmosphere.
Mhm.
So in other words, it's a very nice place to look at the sun. Whereas if you go to Mauna Kea and do that, you will see a little bit of glow around your finger or thumb.
Why is that?
Because there's just a little bit more atmospheric distortion on Mauna Kea than there is on Haleakala.
And yet Mauna Kea is higher.
Yes, and it's also where we do most of our astronomy because Mauna Kea is free of clouds more often. Haleakala, often, if you're on Mauna Kea observing, you look over at Haleakala and it's covered with clouds. So that raising it a little bit up allows you to observe more often.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make the sight considerably better. There's just something about the way the wind patterns flow over Haleakala or the way in which the mountain is formed. It's just ideal for solar observing.
Mm-hmm. There's another observatory coming up on Haleakala, correct?
Yes, it's the Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope, and it's going to be the largest solar telescope in the world, and it's being built right now. I think it's kind of fitting that it's named after Daniel Inouye because he was really kind of forward-thinking and took care of Hawaiians throughout his political career. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Now, some of the telescopes on Mauna Kea are not actually used right now. Is that correct?
No, that's not true. Every one of them is used, with the exception of this very small student telescope. They've been trying to upgrade it. So originally it was a 24-inch telescope, so that's a dish reflecting mirror that's about this size. And they've upgraded it now to about 1 meter. And they've just had a lot of troubles getting it to work. But that's the only one. All the others are working every night.
There's talk about decommissioning some of the telescopes.
Clearly a telescope will work forever. I mean, even that little 24-inch telescope still could get good, interesting things. But we're always trying to do the best science, you know, the hottest stuff, the newest information. And the only way you can do that is to actually have the best telescopes. So for me, as a Hawaiian, it's the best site in the world for doing astronomy, without a doubt. And so you really only should have the best telescopes.
Right.
And some of the older ones are now sort of past their prime. So it is time for them to be decommissioned.
They're still very much usable, but there are much better telescopes in existence. Is that the reason?
Yeah, it's basically that. And while we would like to, you know, keep as many of them going as we could, it makes sense to have only the best on the best. And so the 30-meter, which will be the best telescope in the Northern Hemisphere and quite possibly the best in the world, should go on the best observing site in the world, at a place where astronomy is such an important part of the local tradition.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for
Dr.
having
Paul
me.
Coleman of the Institute for Astronomy of the University of Hawaii, a Hawaiian astronomer. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm Pearl Johnson. Thank you for watching for the League of Women Voters of Honolulu.